The smell of concentrated beef stew was spreading through the air, but today it carried a pungent, bitter taste of the end. The sound of the knife chopping against the heavy oak board echoed steadily, like the heartbeat of a heart trying to cling to its last bit of life. Inside the kitchen of the Gilded Plate, everything was as bright as an operating room, from the shiny stainless steel pans to the red-hot grills. I stood at the center of this controlled chaos, feeling the heat blast into my face, making sweat run into my stinging eyes. For 5 years, this kitchen was my domain, the place where I turned soulless ingredients into works of gustatory art. But today, a terrifying silence enveloped my teammates as Mark walked in. Mark, my brother-in-law and the CEO, stood at the door, his ash-gray suit without a single wrinkle, a total contrast to my grease-stained apron. He didn't bring the smell of food. He brought the scent of expensive perfume and the coldness of figures on a balance sheet. "Jason, into my office right now," he said, his voice thin but as sharp as a filleting knife. I set the knife down, the sound of metal hitting the stainless steel table ringing with a dry clang, signaling that something was about to shatter. Mark's office was located upstairs, overlooking the entire restaurant through one-way glass, where customers were enjoying the glamour I had painstakingly built. Inside, the air conditioner hummed, blowing out a freezing draft that turned the sweat on my neck into ice. On his desk was a glossy folder, next to a crystal glass of whiskey sparkling under the LED lights. "You're fired, Jason," Mark said nonchalantly, as if he were just announcing a change in vegetable suppliers. I went numb, feeling the marble floor beneath my feet as if it were cracking apart. "Fired? After everything I've done to bring this place to 5 stars? Mark took a sip of his drink, the sound of ice clinking against the glass like a mockery. "The world is changing, Jason. People no longer eat with their taste buds, they eat with their eyes and with likes on social media." He turned the laptop screen toward me, displaying the profile of a young man with a polished smile and millions of followers.
"This is Leo, our new head chef. He might not know how to simmer bones for 48 hours like you, but he can make this restaurant explode on TikTok in just 15 seconds. Humiliation rose in my throat, bitter and harder to swallow than any spoiled dish. "He's a fraud, Mark. He doesn't even know how to hold a knife properly." Mark laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the empty room, devoid of any familial warmth.
"Results are the only thing of value, Jason, and you are just a redundant part of the past. This restaurant doesn't need a chef, it needs a star." I looked at my hands, the burns and calluses being the evidence of thousands of hours of hard work. It turned out that in the eyes of my wife's family, devotion was just an outdated figure. I turned my back and walked away, not needing a goodbye. The sound of my heels on the stone floor sounding as lonely as a ghost. The fire in the kitchen was still burning, But for me, it had died out from the moment Mark pushed the firing folder toward me. I left the gilded plate with a worn-out cardboard box containing a few personal knives and smothered dreams. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the city in a white and silent shroud. But the cold out there was nothing compared to the frost in my heart. 5 years ago, my wife and I had sworn to build a culinary empire. But when the money flowed in, she chose to stand by her brother. The betrayal of family was like a toxic spice, slowly seeping into every warm memory I once had. I used my last savings to rent a small kiosk in a narrow alley, where the smell of mold and the blare of car horns replaced the luxury of Aspen. My new kitchen was less than 10 square meters, with peeling walls and an old gas stove that often flared up. I spent the whole week scrubbing the rust off the stainless steel sink, the feeling of cold iron touching my skin, making me clearer than ever.
Each brushstroke was a cleansing of the fake arrogance I once carried when I was at the peak. My internal monologue now only revolved around the smell of burnt onions and rough charcoal smoke. I didn't need Crystal. I didn't need the empty praise of those who only knew how to photograph food. I needed the truth in every spoonful of soup.
On the day my small shop opened, there was no red ribbon, no cameras, only the aroma of old-school onion soup wafting to the end of the alley. But Mark didn't leave me alone. He didn't want me to just fail. He wanted me wiped out. He stood at the head of the alley in his shiny black Mercedes, looking down at my shop with obvious disgust.
"Truly pathetic, Jason," he said through the car window, his voice still carrying its inherent condescension. "Do you think people will ignore my glamour to come into this rat hole to eat?" That evening, the first reviews appeared on the shop's social media page. "The food is like trash. The chef is filthy. It tastes like sewer water." Fake accounts with anonymous names constantly bombed my passion with the dirtiest review comments. I sat in the darkness of the small shop, the light from my phone screen reflecting my gaunt face. Mark had hired professional dirty reviewers to drown me before I could even begin. I could feel his glee in every malicious line of text. He wanted to prove that without the support of the Grants, I was nothing. But he had forgotten a basic thing I had learned after all these years in the kitchen. That is true flavor, cannot be buried by lies, no matter how much money they are paid for. I picked up my old apron, tightened the straps, and felt the warmth of the stove begin to spread. The fragrant smell of sautéed garlic began to fill the small room, drowning out the smell of mold and hatred outside. The more I was pushed into the mud, the more I felt myself burning bright. Mark wanted a war. I would give him a war, but not with fake likes. I would fight with the very thing he had lost, the soul of the food. Every humiliation today would be the spice for my return tomorrow. The small alley where my shop was located at night always carried a characteristic smell of rough urban life.
It was a mixture of the dampness of old bricks, the sound of car horns from afar, and the thick, fragrant smoke from my pot of onion soup. Inside the cramped space, my rhythm had become a symphony of patience. The crackle of the old gas stove, the clatter of the wooden ladle hitting the bottom of the cast-iron pot, all echoed steadily like a promise to myself.
I had spent 16 hours a day here, working silently, while the world outside seemed to have forgotten my existence. Meanwhile, at the Gilded Plate, Mark was indulging in an illusion of success. He organized brilliant light parties where Leo, the hot boy chef, performed flashy pan-tossing moves under the camera flashes.
Their banquet tables glittered with crystal and silver, looking like a photo in a lifestyle magazine, perfect on the outside, but frozen within. Leo's food was presented like sculptures, but its taste was bland and soulless, just like the way he held a knife. But on social media, the Gilded Plate was still a legend thanks to heavy spending on media and glossy reviews. Mark thought he could use money to redefine the taste buds of an entire city. He still hadn't stopped attacking me. Every morning when I opened my phone, I saw dozens of new one-star reviews with blatant fabrications. I saw cockroaches in the soup, one fake account wrote. The chef shouted at customers, another fabricated. The taste of these lies was more pungent than the trash at the head of the alley.
One afternoon, as I was meticulously slicing onions for my soup, a man in a health inspector's uniform walked in. He looked at my small shop with a scrutinizing gaze, a clipboard in hand, like a death sentence. I knew immediately this was Mark's work. Someone reported your shop for serious food safety violations, the inspector said, his voice as dry as the sound of sandpaper.
I didn't say a word, only silently stepped aside for him to check every corner of the stainless steel kitchen I had scrubbed so much I could see my reflection. He opened the fridge, checked the expiration date of every spice, even scrutinized the tile grout under the stove. After an hour, he sighed, his face clearly showing disappointment, because he didn't find a single speck of dust. Everything is perfectly unbelievable, he muttered, then turned and walked straight out of the alley. My silence was not cowardice. It was a fortress that Mark could not break with dirty tricks. I turned back to my soup pot, where the fire was still burning low, extracting deep sweetness from the most humble ingredients. Mark had taught me a valuable lesson, that true power does not lie in virtual numbers on the internet, but in the control over one's own soul. While he was busy building an empire of sand, I was building a legacy with integrity. I realized that Mark was afraid. He feared that the true flavor of my old-school onion soup would shake Leo's fake throne. That's why he frantically hired more dirty reviewers, trying to drown my shop in eternal darkness.
He called me a failure, an unwashed-up chef chewing on humble delusions. But every spoonful of soup I cooked contained the truth that none of his money could buy. I spent this time restudying the classic techniques that modern chefs like Leo had ignored to follow empty trends.
I saw the first customers begin to return. They were ordinary workers, people who didn't eat with a camera, but with their hearts. This dish, it reminds me of my grandmother. An old man who frequently visited the shop said, his eyes lighting up with a simple joy. That was the reward that the gilded plate would never have, no matter how much gold they plated onto every dish.
The tension escalated when I knew that the ultimate judge, the critic, was about to visit this city. Mark was going crazy preparing for that event. He wanted to use the Grant family's status to force the critic to recognize Leo as the #1 head chef. He didn't know that the critic was the one who taught me that a chef without a soul is just a hired fire starter. Every night, I stood on the rooftop of the old building, looking toward the glass tower of the gilded plate, brilliant with lights. I saw their arrogance glittering, but as cold as aspen frost. They thought they had won. They thought my silence was surrender. But they didn't know that I was just waiting until their lies were big enough to collapse under their own weight.
My small alley was dark, but the fire in my kitchen had never burned brighter. My return would not start with the sound of fireworks, but with a flavor that would stun the whole city. My journey is only just beginning. The whole city today seemed to hold its breath before the appearance of the critic, the judge with razor-sharp eyes and a palate likened to a scale of justice.
At the gilded plate, Mark had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to turn the restaurant into the most brilliant performance stage possible. The scents of the most expensive essential oils were sprayed throughout the hall, trying to create an atmosphere of absolute luxury. Leo stood in the kitchen, his white uniform without a single spot, rehearsing his skillful pan-tossing moves under the direction of a professional film crew.
They had prepared a perfect script, from lighting and music to flowery narrations to welcome the distinguished guest. Mark paced back and forth in the hall, clutching a crystal glass, sweat breaking out on his forehead, even though the air conditioner was running at full capacity. He believed that with this glamour, no one could resist the power of the Grant family.
Finally, the critic appeared, a middle-aged man with a humble appearance, wearing travel-worn clothes, a total contrast to the shiny surroundings. The critic sat down at the most VIP table, looking through the plates of food elaborately decorated with gold leaf and Leo's strange foam sauces. Mark stood beside him, pouring out advertisements about new culinary philosophy and the vision of a young star. The critic picked up the silver spoon, tasted a bit of Leo's glittering sauce, then slowly set it down. The whole room suddenly fell into a terrifying silence, so much so that one could hear the soft snow falling outside the glass. "This is not food," the critic said, his voice low but
booming like a sentence. This is a cheap magic trick wrapped in gold leaf. It has shape, it has color, but it is completely soulless.
Mark was stunned, the smile on his lips frozen as if by ice. Sir, this is the most modern cooking technology. Leo is a head chef with millions of followers. The critic stood up, his gaze looking through the restaurant's glossy veneer. 1 million followers cannot buy 1 second of devotion to the kitchen fire. I came here to find the flavor of the city, not to watch a circus performance.
He turned and walked away, leaving Mark and Leo standing among the ruins of fake arrogance. The critic wandered through the streets. Then his gourmet instinct led him into the dark alley where my small shop's fire was glowing. The scent of sweet caramelized onions mixed with the pungent smell of black pepper wafted from the old gas stove, creating an irresistible pull.
He walked into the shop, sat down on the worn wooden chair, and watched me quietly stirring the soup pot. I recognized him immediately, but I said nothing, only ladled out a bowl of hot soup and set it on the table. My bowl of soup had no bold leaf, no foam sauce, only a deep amber color and sincere steam.
The critic brought a spoonful of soup to his mouth, closed his eyes to feel the explosion of flavor, a warmth spreading to the very depths of his soul. Jason? He softly called my name, his eyes blurring with emotion. Just then, Mark stormed into the shop with a face bright red from rage and humiliation. He was about to shout, intending to use his power to kick this filthy guest out to cover up his failure.
"What are you doing in this rat hole?" Mark screamed, pointing his finger at the soup bowl on the table. The critic stood up, his appearance now full of power and majesty. "Shut up, Mark," he said, his voice as stern as steel, making Mark take a step back. "You call this a rat hole, but this is the very place holding the soul of this city. While you were busy polishing your empty shell, Jason rebuilt an entire legacy from the ashes."
The critic pulled out his phone, directly posting a status on the world's most influential review page. The $1 million restaurant, The Gilded Plate, is a pile of magnificent trash. And this small shop in the alley is the only place you'll find the truth in every bite. The sentence was pronounced sharp and decisive, like a finishing blow to the lies.
Mark collapsed onto the dirty cement floor, the expensive wine glass in his hand falling and shattering into 1,000 tiny shards. His collapse did not start from numbers, but from the moment he despised the power of a sincere bowl of soup. I looked at him with no glee, only an absolute peace, as the fire in the kitchen still burned brilliantly and warmly. The dawn of the next day stretched across the city in a cold, silvery gray ribbon.
The media storm had swept through, leaving behind a pile of ruins of the lies named the Grant family and the Gilded Plate. In the financial newspapers and culinary forums, Mark Grant's name was being torn apart by the very people who once hailed him. The corporation's stock plummeted, investors fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. The collapse of an empire built on sand always happens quickly and ruthlessly like that.
I stood before my small shop, watching the white smoke from the early morning onion soup pot tan into the air. The small alley was no longer quiet. Lines of people began to form from the head of the alley, patiently waiting in the cold just to enjoy a sincere bowl of soup. They didn't hold their phones to live stream. They didn't try to pose beside gold-plated dishes. They stood there, rubbing their hands together for warmth and breathing in the scent of truth spreading from my kitchen. I saw Mark standing in the distance across the street. He no longer had the shiny suit, no longer the luxury Mercedes. He stood there, lonely and small, looking at the crowd surrounding my shop with a gaze both resentful and desperate. He had lost everything: reputation, power, and the illusion that money could control the world's taste buds. I didn't feel glee. I only felt a strange lightness, as if I had just shed a heavy, dust-filled coat. My silence and patience all this time was not weakness. It was a silent preparation so that the truth could speak for itself. I returned to the kitchen fire, feeling the warm heat envelop my face. The crackle of the fire, the aroma of caramelized onions, and the briny taste of sea salt. This was my world. True success is not how many likes you have or how many sycophants surround you. It lies in whether you can look directly into the mirror and know that you never betrayed the soul of the food you cook. This small shop might not have crystal or silk, but it has the warmth of integrity. I looked at the bowl of soup in my hand, the clear amber color reflecting the sparkling dawn light. A chef's legacy does not lie in glass towers, but in the peaceful smiles of customers after every spoonful of soup. The city still moves with its ruthless rhythm and its bottomless ambitions, but inside this small alley, time seems to stand still, to make room for eternal values. I took a deep breath of the clean, early morning air. No longer the taste of lies. The past has receded, leaving a solid foundation for what I am about to build, an empire of truth. I smiled, a silent and free smile. The fire in the kitchen still burns brilliantly, ready to light up the souls searching for a true flavor in a life full of dirty reviews. My journey is only just beginning.